The chapel was perfectly still, every detail arranged with military precision for General Morrison's funeral at Arlington National Cemetery. Front rows brimmed with decorated officers, generals, admirals, and high-ranking officials, each adorned with ribbons and stars symbolizing decades of service. The priest stood ready at the podium, prayer book open, prepared to begin the solemn ceremony. Just as the priest opened his mouth to speak, the chapel doors creaked open one last time. An elderly man entered, moving slowly but with a bearing that demanded attention. Heads turned, expecting him to quietly slip to the back and remain unseen. But what happened next stunned everyone. Without hesitation, the entire front row rose as one. Uniforms snapping to attention, eyes fixed respectfully on the man making his way forward. Generals and admirals stood side by side, their collective salute an unspoken testament to a man whose presence commanded reverence beyond words. Whispers spread through the chapel like wildfire. This was General of the Army Samuel Torres, the highest-ranking officer present, whose arrival stopped the ceremony before it had even begun, reminding everyone why respect in the military is earned over a lifetime. Welcome to Echoes of Honor. Before we continue this powerful story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. Arlington National Cemetery's Old Post Chapel had hosted thousands of military funerals throughout its distinguished history, but few had drawn the level of distinguished attendance as General Richard Morrison's service that crisp October morning. Morrison had been what military professionals called a soldier's general, beloved by enlisted personnel for his genuine care and concern for their welfare, and respected by his peers for his strategic brilliance, unwavering integrity, and ability to make difficult decisions under pressure. His unexpected death from a heart attack at age 72 had shocked the military community and prompted tributes from leaders across all branches of service. The funeral drew active and retired military leadership from every corner of the defense establishment, creating a gathering that represented the finest traditions of American military service and sacrifice. Current Joint Chiefs of Staff sat alongside theater commanders who had served under Morrison's leadership. Retired generals and admirals who had known him throughout his distinguished career filled the pews, their collective experience representing centuries of military service and dedication to the principles that made military life both challenging and rewarding. The seating arrangement followed strict military protocol that had been developed over decades to ensure proper recognition of rank, service, and relationship to the deceased. The front row was reserved for the highest-ranking active duty officers, the current Joint Chiefs of Staff, theater commanders responsible for operations around the globe, and service secretaries who managed the vast bureaucracies that kept the military functioning. Behind them sat retired generals and admirals whose distinguished careers had earned them permanent places in the hierarchy of military respect and recognition. The third section held colonels and their naval equivalents, officers who represented the backbone of military leadership and who had worked closely with General Morrison throughout various stages of his career. Field-grade officers and distinguished civilians filled the remaining seats, each person present because they had been touched in some way by Morrison's leadership, mentorship, or friendship during his 4 decades of military service. Father Michael O'Brien, the post chaplain who had conducted hundreds of military funerals during his 15 years at Arlington, understood the importance of timing, the significance of protocol, and the solemnity required for occasions that marked the passing of distinguished military leaders. He'd reviewed his notes one final time, positioned himself at the podium as the official start time arrived, and surveyed the assembled gathering with the satisfaction of someone who had ensured that every detail had been properly arranged and every participant knew their role in honoring the deceased. The chapel doors had been quietly closed by the funeral director 5 minutes before the scheduled start time, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin and that latecomers would need to wait for an appropriate moment to enter. This was standard protocol for high-level military funerals, designed to maintain the dignity of the proceedings and ensure that the ceremony could proceed without interruption or distraction. Father O'Brien opened his prayer book to the carefully marked page, cleared his throat softly to signal the beginning of the service, and prepared to offer the opening invocation that would begin General Morrison's final tribute. The gathering had settled into respectful silence, with only the soft sounds of shifting fabric and quiet breathing to mark the presence of the hundreds of mourners who had come to pay their respects. But just as he drew breath to speak the opening words of the funeral service, the heavy chapel doors swung open with a soft creak that carried in the absolute silence of the gathered assembly. Every head turned toward the sound, expecting to see a late-arriving family member or perhaps a junior officer who had been delayed by duty requirements or transportation difficulties. Instead, they saw an elderly man silhouetted in the doorway, his figure backlit by the morning sun that streamed through the entrance. He appeared to be in his mid-80s, moving with the careful deliberation of advanced age but maintaining a bearing that was unmistakably military despite his civilian clothes. His dark suit was simple but dignified, well-maintained over many years, and his posture spoke of decades of command presence that had become so ingrained it was now part of his basic character. Father O'Brien paused mid-breath, his mouth still open to speak, uncertain whether to continue with the opening prayer or wait for the late arrival to find a seat. Chapel protocol called for beginning on time regardless of stragglers, but something about this man's entrance felt significant in a way the chaplain couldn't immediately define. There was something in the way he moved, in his bearing, that suggested this wasn't just another late-arriving mourner. The elderly man closed the chapel doors quietly behind him with the kind of practiced consideration that suggested familiarity with military protocol and respect for solemn occasions. He began making his way down the center aisle with measured and deliberate steps, each footfall echoing softly in the silent chamber as hundreds of pairs of eyes followed his progress toward the front of the chapel. As he passed each row, occupants turned to watch his movement, many with expressions of growing recognition and surprise that suggested they were beginning to understand who they were seeing. Military officers with decades of experience in reading bearing and recognizing command presence were starting to realize that this late arrival was someone of extraordinary significance. It was General Patricia Hayes in the front row who first understood who they were witnessing. As the Army's highest-ranking female officer and a student of military history who had made it her business to know the legends of American military service, she recognized the distinctive bearing and presence of someone who had commanded at the highest levels of military leadership. She rose from her seat immediately, her movement so swift and decisive that it drew the attention of everyone around her and sent a ripple of awareness through the front section of the chapel. General Thomas Rodriguez, chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the senior military officer present at the funeral, followed General Hayes's lead without hesitation. His decades of experience had taught him to recognize when something unprecedented was occurring, and the presence of this particular man at General Morrison's funeral clearly qualified as such a moment. Rodriguez's military instincts told him that whoever this man was, he commanded respect from General Hayes, and that was enough to warrant his own immediate attention and recognition. One by one, every officer in the front row stood in a display of synchronized respect that was as unprecedented as it was moving. Admiral James Mitchell, the Chief of Naval Operations, rose with the fluid motion of someone accustomed to rendering honors to senior officers. General Susan Chun, Commandant of the Marine Corps, stood with the crisp precision that marked her as a leader who understood the importance of military courtesy. General David Williams, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, followed suit with the kind of automatic response that came from decades of military training and protocol. The sight was extraordinary and deeply moving. The most powerful military leaders in the American defense establishment standing in unison to honor a man whose identity remained unknown to most of the gathering. These were not people who stood casually or without purpose. Each held positions that required them to render appropriate honors to senior officers, and their collective response sent a clear message to the rest of the gathering that something of profound significance was occurring. The wave of recognition and respect spread backward through the chapel as retired generals and admirals began to understand what was happening and joined their active duty colleagues in standing. The sound of rustling fabric filled the air as hundreds of distinguished military officers rose to their feet, creating a sea of standing figures that stretched from the front of the chapel to the back. Admiral Sarah Johnson, a retired chief of naval operations who had served during some of the most challenging periods of recent military history, was among the first to whisper the truth that was spreading through the gathering. That's General of the Army Samuel Torres. The name rippled through the crowd like an electric current, carrying with it the weight of military history and the recognition of extraordinary service. General of the Army was a five-star rank that had been held by only 5 men in American history, reserved for officers whose contributions to national defense and military leadership transcended normal measures of achievement. It was a rank that commanded automatic respect from every military officer regardless of their own rank or position. Samuel Torres had earned his 5 stars through 4 decades of distinguished service that included combat leadership in 3 different conflicts, strategic planning that had shaped modern military doctrine, and mentorship of officers who now held the highest positions in the American military establishment. His influence on military thinking and leadership development was immeasurable, and his presence at any military gathering was considered an extraordinary honor. Father O'Brien, understanding now that he was witnessing something far beyond normal funeral protocol, abandoned his prepared script and waited respectfully for General Torres to find his seat. The chaplain had conducted services attended by high-ranking military officials, but never in the presence of a general of the army, and he understood that this moment required flexibility and recognition of the unprecedented nature of the situation. General Torres moved through the chapel with the measured pace of someone who understood that his presence had transformed the ceremony into something larger than a simple funeral. He acknowledged the standing officers with subtle nods of recognition, his bearing reflecting both the humility of advanced age and the command presence that had marked his entire career. Mrs. Morrison, General Morrison's widow, watched from the front row as this distinguished figure approached, her confusion evident as she tried to understand why the entire military leadership of the nation had risen to honor a man she didn't recognize. Her husband had mentioned General Torres in conversations over the years, always with the deepest respect and admiration, but she had never met him personally and wasn't certain why he would attend Richard's funeral. Colonel James Patterson, who had served as General Morrison's aide-de-camp during his final assignment, stepped forward to escort General Torres to an appropriate seat, understanding that protocol required special accommodation for an officer of his rank and stature. The colonel's training had prepared him for many situations, but hosting a general of the army at a funeral was beyond his normal experience. General Torres, Colonel Patterson said with the kind of respectful formality that marked interactions with the most senior military officers, on behalf of Mrs. Morrison and the family, thank you for honoring us with your presence. We have reserved a seat for you in the front row. General Torres smiled with the gracious humility that had marked his interactions throughout his distinguished career. Thank you, Colonel, but I prefer to sit where General Morrison would have expected me, among his fellow soldiers. The response was typical of Torres, who despite his exalted rank had never lost touch with the common soldiers and had always insisted on being treated as a fellow officer rather than a figure to be revered from a distance. His decision to sit among the gathered officers rather than in a position of special honor reflected the character that had earned him respect throughout the military establishment. As General Torres took his seat in the third row among the colonels and general officers who had served with Morrison throughout his career, the rest of the gathering slowly resumed their seats, though the energy in the chapel had been permanently transformed by his presence. The ceremony was no longer simply a funeral for a respected general. It had become a gathering of military history, presided over by one of the few men who had achieved the highest rank in American military service. Father O'Brien finally began the service, but his opening words acknowledged the unprecedented nature of the gathering and the honor represented by General Torres's presence. We are gathered here today not only to honor General Morrison's distinguished service, but to witness the respect and recognition that his life and leadership earned from the finest military officers our nation has produced, including one of the few men to hold the rank of General of the Army. The eulogy that followed took on added significance as speakers shared memories of General Morrison's service while in the presence of an officer whose own career represented the pinnacle of military achievement. General Torres listened with the attention of someone who understood the weight of leadership and the importance of recognizing those who had served with distinction. When Colonel Patterson shared stories of Morrison's mentorship and leadership development, General Torres nodded with recognition, understanding the importance of officers who dedicated their careers to developing the next generation of military leaders. When Admiral Mitchell spoke about Morrison's strategic thinking and contributions to joint operations, Torres's attention reflected his own experience in strategic planning and the challenges of coordinating military efforts across multiple services. During the presentation of the flag to Mrs. Morrison, General Torres stood with the rest of the gathering, his presence lending additional solemnity to the ceremony and ensuring that General Morrison's final honors were rendered in the presence of one of the most distinguished military officers in American history. After the formal ceremony concluded, General Torres was approached by dozens of officers who wanted to pay their respects and thank him for attending the funeral. Many shared stories of how his leadership and example had influenced their own careers, creating an impromptu receiving line that demonstrated the respect and admiration he commanded throughout the military establishment. Mrs. Morrison was introduced to General Torres during the reception, where he shared memories of her husband that revealed a personal friendship that had spanned decades despite their different ranks and positions. "Richard was one of the finest officers I ever had the privilege to serve with," Torres told her. "His dedication to his soldiers and his commitment to excellence influenced everyone who worked with him." "He spoke of you often," Mrs. Morrison replied, "always with the deepest respect and admiration. He said you were the standard by which he measured his own leadership." General Torres smiled with the humility that had marked his interactions throughout his career. "We all learned from each other. That's what made the military such a special brotherhood. We were all committed to the same principles and dedicated to taking care of each other." As the gathering dispersed, many attendees reflected on the extraordinary nature of what they had witnessed. A funeral that had begun as a tribute to a respected general had become a lesson in military courtesy, respect, and the enduring bonds that connect military officers across generations and ranks. Young officers present at the ceremony would remember for the rest of their careers the moment when the entire front row of military leadership stood to honor General Torres, understanding that they had witnessed the kind of respect that comes only from extraordinary service and character. The image of the most powerful military leaders in America rising as one to recognize a fellow officer became a defining moment in their understanding of military tradition and the importance of honoring those who had served with distinction. General Torres's presence at the funeral served as a reminder that military service creates bonds that transcend rank, position, and time. His willingness to attend the funeral of a fellow officer, despite the challenges of age and travel, demonstrated the commitment to brotherhood that defines the best traditions of military service. The ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery became more than a funeral. It became a masterclass in leadership, respect, and the enduring values that make military service both challenging and rewarding. The presence of a general of the Army elevated the entire gathering and ensured that General Morrison's final tribute would be remembered as one of the most distinguished military ceremonies in recent memory. Sometimes respect is demonstrated not through words, but through actions, not through speeches, but through presence. General Torres's attendance at the funeral and the response it generated from every military officer present became a lesson in the kind of character and commitment that defines true military leadership. The elderly man who had entered the chapel late had transformed the entire ceremony through the simple act of showing up, demonstrating that the highest honors in military service come not from rank or position, but from the respect and recognition earned through a lifetime of service, sacrifice, and dedication to the principles that make military life meaningful. This story was brought to you by Echoes of Honor. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Maybe someone whose presence alone commanded respect, whose character spoke louder than any title or position. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.